Hello, everybody, and welcome to today's webinar, Insights into Glaucoma and Women's Health, exploring the impact of menopause and visual function. My name is Elena Sturman. I am the President and CEO of the Glaucoma Foundation. TGF was founded in 1984, almost 40 years ago, with a mission to improve the lives of people with glaucoma. We identify and fund innovative research with a goal of restoring vision and eradicating blindness from this disease. And we work daily to raise awareness and provide information, education, and support to our patients. I am very excited to introduce to you Dr. Andrew Feola. Dr. Feola was among 15 scientists sharing their work at our most recent glaucoma think tank in June. These experts join us from across the US, Australia, and England, and presented on a range of topics from the importance of big data in glaucoma research to the prospect of neurodegeneration. Dr. Feola is the assistant professor in the Department of Ophthalmology at Emory University and a research biologist at the Atlanta VA in the Center for Visual and Neurocognitive Rehabilitation, where his lab investigates glaucoma from the perspective of women's health. Glaucoma is a leading cause of irreversible blindness worldwide. 59% of glaucoma patients are female. Therefore, it is worthwhile to understand if there are associations between female reproductive factors and glaucoma. Dr. Feola and his group focus on understanding how menopause and estrogen play a role in risk factors related to onset of glaucoma and visual function. In this webinar, he will discuss his ongoing preclinical work of glaucoma and menopause and explore the clinical association between the onset of menopause and glaucoma. As always, there will be a Q&A session at the end of the presentation. You may ask a question by writing it into a chat or Q&A button, and we will do our best to answer as many questions as we can. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Dr. Andrew Feola, and let's begin.
Thank you for that introduction. I'm very happy and excited to be here and talk to you about the work that our lab and our group overall has been doing, specifically on the insights into glaucoma and women's health. So today, before we even get started, in reality, I'd like to make some acknowledgements for the seminar I'm about to give. One is to the Glaucoma Foundation, not only for the invitation to this webinar here, but also to being part of the foundation at the think tank meeting earlier this year, because they're giving a lot of focus to this underrepresented or understudied area of research in women's health and glaucoma. I'd also like to thank collaborators that work with our lab, people that have been previously in the lab, current members of the lab as well, along with our funding sources, whose without their support, we wouldn't be able to do the work or the research we're currently doing. So as many of you probably know, glaucoma is the leading cause of irreversible blindness worldwide, and it affects 75 million people. However, it's not a single condition. It's actually a group of heterogeneous eye conditions that cause blindness, and they typically present similarly, even though they might have different etiologies or different causes. There's a characteristic loss of peripheral vision. So here we have an image from the National Eye Institute. On the left, you see what a normal person might see, whereas on the right, you see someone with glaucomatous vision. And what you're seeing is the loss of peripheral vision. But in reality, this is somewhat of a dramatization of what someone with glaucoma can see. They don't actually start losing or having black in their vision. And I would be remiss if I didn't talk about some of the work done here at Emory by a colleague, Dr. Deepta Gatti, who actually studies what glaucoma patients might see. So in short, what they do is they kind of present these patients with a scene that has depth and objects in it. So you might see a test image here, and they can say what's blurry, what they can see, or what they can't see. So you see things on the left of the image, on the right, center, buildings in the peripheral and laterally. And what's interesting is they can actually test one eye versus another. And so you can see one glaucoma patient's eye response, and they say on the left vision, it's very blurry at the top. So it's not black as previously illustrated, but it's very blurry. But on the right here, or I'm sorry, on the left of the image, you can see they really don't see this banana peel. They don't see the garbage can coming in here. And on the right, they don't see the ball, and the individual is very blurry. However, when you look at their right image, it's actually a little different than the left eye, what the left eye sees. So now if we look at the left part of that image, they don't see any of the cones, bananas, anything on the bottom half of that image, but the person is more in focus. And I think this is really interesting because then they actually did, okay, well, if you combine both eyes, what does that person see? And you actually can tell now in this last image, that person can actually see a lot more than each individual eye. So when you combine vision from both eyes, they actually see almost everything on that left side of the image and on the right side of the image, even though the peripheral, the top of that image is still very blurry. The eye, combining both information from both eyes and the brain, can fill in a lot of the gaps in vision. And that's why it's often referred to, or glaucomas are often referred to as the silent theft of sight, because you might not notice or realize you're losing a lot of vision until you almost can see nothing in that image. But we're here largely to talk about glaucoma as a women's health issue. So this is also information or data provided from the National Eye Institute, which is kind of the federal level funding for eye research. And they do a lot of studies on gathering information of prevalence in the population. So if we look at the distribution of females here in this hollow versus the number of males that have glaucoma, you can actually see there's a higher prevalence of glaucoma overall for females versus males. And this actually equates to what is represented in a lot of studies, where 59% of the glaucomatous population is female versus 41%, which are males. However, a lot of people continue to attribute this to the fact that women live longer, and glaucoma is a disease of aging, meaning it increases in prevalence as you get older, or becomes more common as you age. And if you look at the rest of the data by years, you can actually see that that's very true. In both males and females, the prevalence or how often people will get glaucoma increases with age. And this is particularly true when you look at individuals over 80 years of age, where there's a higher prevalence of glaucoma in females than males. And again, this is often attributed to the fact that women live longer, but I don't think that's critically looking at the data that we have, because that means if we only considered adults at 80 years older, and we said there's 100 males over the age of 80, that means that only 6 males would be affected by glaucoma. Equally, if we took 100 females over the age of 80, there'd be 9 females affected by glaucoma. That means that in this population over 80 years of age, there's more females affected than males. So even when you break it up, there's a higher prevalence. In addition, that doesn't account for the fact that women have a higher rate of glaucoma in the younger population compared to males. So it can't be simply aging. There must be something else going on. And the major risk factor for developing glaucoma is elevated eye pressure, or intraocular pressure, abbreviated IOP in the rest of this talk. So IOP is the major causal risk factor for developing glaucoma. Many of you, if you're a patient, probably have had intraocular pressure measured or routinely checked to see how it's going. And they do this because previous studies have shown that the relative risk for developing glaucoma, is shown on the y-axis of this graph, versus eye pressure, or IOP, increases as pressure in your eye increases. It becomes particularly high when you reach a region that's called ocular hypertension. So that means a pressure in your eye above 21 millimeters of mercury. And that's when you start to really have a high risk of developing glaucoma. And why is this important for women? Well, menopause has actually been shown to increase intraocular pressure by 1 to 3 millimeters of mercury. And while that seems small or relatively small, you have to consider that if you had an intraocular pressure of 15 millimeters of mercury, and you have this 1 to 3 millimeter of mercury increase in IOP, that's equivalent to basically a twofold or 2 times higher risk of developing glaucoma. In addition, if a patient had a 19 to 21 millimeter of mercury pressure, and you have this modest elevation in pressure, that's associated with a 10-fold relative risk of developing glaucoma. And that's really important because menopause is a permanent change in biology in women's life. So essentially, after menopause, this 1 to 3 millimeter of mercury elevation is chronic or sustained for the rest of that person's life. In addition, there's been a few other studies to kind of better understand the risks associated with developing glaucoma with menopause or estrogen. So for example, and we'll talk about this a little bit more in a little bit, the timing or age of menopause is associated with the risk of developing glaucoma. Estrogen receptor mutations, so how estrogen is processed by tissues in the body, are also associated with elevations in intraocular pressure and the development of glaucoma. And lastly, variations in DNA sequences, typically called polymorphisms, in estrogen metabolic pathways, which are basically how it's degraded, are also associated with the development of glaucoma. So since we are kind of focusing on menopause, we should probably define it, at least in the general sense. So menopause is often defined as just 12 months without menstruation, and it occurs typically at the age of 51 years of age. In the United States, there are 6,000 women a day that become postmenopausal. And if we extrapolate that for an entire year, that's roughly 2 million or more women that become postmenopausal each year. And what's interesting is we know menopause affects systems throughout the whole body. We know it affects cognitive function, hair, thermoregulation, like temperature control, cardiovascular and heart health, the pelvic floor, bladder, and bone health. So to me, as a scientist or researcher, and many individuals, if you'd be curious, it'd be kind of crazy to think that we know menopause affects literally the hair on our heads to the bones in our feet, and somehow would skip over the eye. So I think we need to better assess if menopause is associated with factors related to developing glaucoma. And in fact, menopause is a highly researched topic. If you did just kind of searches in kind of these scientific databases for menopause and estrogen, you'd actually see that there's a lot of research focused on menopause and estrogen in the central nervous system, so brain, spine health, where there's over 24,000 articles. In bone, it's very heavily studied as well, where there's over 27,000. And the same is in the cardiovascular system, so that's the heart and blood vessels, where there's over 20,000. And there's actually a good number in the eye, although not the same magnitude, because menopause and estrogen have been associated with certain eye diseases such as dry eye as well. So the one thing I like to do is look at the comparable impact of menopause across fields, and I often use cardiovascular disease as the direct comparison. And I do this for several reasons. One, because cardiovascular disease includes heart attacks, blood pressure, which are often associated with people thinking it's a male-dominated disease, right? And I think that's often attributed to the fact that males have a tendency of having large cardiac events that are sudden and catastrophic, so they're inducing death. But actually, if you look at the percentage of people suffering from cardiovascular disease, a majority of it is women. 54% of people suffering from cardiovascular disease are women. And if you just review what we talked about for glaucoma, it's 59% of the population are women in glaucoma. And what's interesting is if you look at the timing of menopause and the relative risk of developing each of the diseases, they're actually very similar. So for example, if a woman becomes menopausal early, so that's less than 45 years of age, there's a 2-time higher risk of developing cardiovascular disease, which is actually pretty similar to what some studies have shown for glaucoma, where women are at a 2.5 or 3 times higher risk of developing glaucoma. And if women go into menopause later in life or after 55 years of age, there's actually a reduced risk for both cardiovascular disease and developing glaucoma. So that kind of, again, hints that there's something going on with menopause and these diseases. And the other reason I particularly bring up cardiovascular disease is the fact that menopause is considered a sex-specific risk factor for developing cardiovascular disease, where it is not considered a sex-specific risk factor for developing glaucoma, at least not yet. And I think that's important again, because if we go back to the overall glaucomatous population, we're calling the 59% are female. If we just looked at the 59% of that population of glaucoma, as far as I know, 100% of aging women will become menopausal at some point in their life. And 6% of those women will become menopausal early, meaning they're at a higher risk for developing glaucoma. So we should really probably investigate this because it's probably important to our understanding of the disease itself. So one thing we should consider are, well, what are some major factors that modulate eye pressure? Again, this is intraocular pressure, abbreviated IOP. And the main factor that regulates eye pressure is called outflow facility. So what is outflow facility? Well, if we look at an eye here, and we kind of zoom in at this part called the anterior chamber, this whole part of the eye is filled with a fluid. It's a clear fluid. It gets produced here in these muscles, and it has to get out of the eye. So outflow facility is actually measured as the fluid outflow at an intraocular pressure. So in a very general sense, that's how easy fluid can flow out of the eye. And outflow facility is actually very important. So if we look at just, you have a normal eye pressure, you have a normal outflow facility. If you had a lower outflow facility, that's often associated with a higher intraocular pressure, and it has been associated with some types of glaucoma. However, if you have a higher outflow facility, it typically means you can lower your pressure. And targeting outflow facility is relevant for many glaucoma treatments where they actually try to lower outflow facility to lower your eye pressure and therefore help, I guess, prevent the loss of vision in your disease. So the question then is, well, does menopause actually impact eye pressure and outflow facility if it's so important? So one study in the 70s actually took women and measured intraocular pressure and outflow facility after hysterectomy with their ovaries removed. So this was a long time ago. And then what they did is they prescribed them hormones containing estrogen for 6 months. And what they actually found is that when they were postmenopausal, they had roughly an intraocular pressure of 16 millimeters of mercury, which lowered after 6 months of receiving estrogen. And when they actually measured outflow facility, they said, well, the postmenopausal women had a lower outflow facility, meaning that that fluid was harder to get out of the eye, compared to then when they were receiving estrogen after 6 months. So that's interesting because it's at least some clinical data showing that menopause or estrogen actually affect both intraocular pressure and outflow facility. But that was in the 70s, and we can't do many things that they used to do. So we're currently turning a lot to basic science or animal models. So to do that, we use a model of menopause. So we have animals. And what we do is we do a surgical menopause. We induce surgical menopause called an ovarectomy, which is abbreviated OVX, where we go in, we remove the ovaries, and we close the tissue back up. Or we do what we call as a sham surgery, where we go in, do the same surgical procedure, but instead of removing the ovaries, you just look at them to inspect them and then close back up. And so we do these two as controls for the surgery itself. So the sham surgery is a control for the ovarectomy. And these are just kind of terms we're going to be using or referencing in different parts of the talk. So I wanted to kind of clear them up now. But if you ever get confused or lost, just every time they're on the slide, they're going to be right here in the bottom left-hand corner. So sham will mean premenopausal and OVX will stand for postmenopausal. So what we did first is we looked at surgical menopause impact in eye pressure. So we took these animals and we literally measured intraocular pressure using a tonolab, and that's a device that actually is clinically used for patients as well. And what we found is that there was a modest increase in eye pressure after surgical menopause. So the black line here represents the sham or the premenopausal animals, the distribution of eye pressure, where the overectomized or postmenopause, you can see there's a shift to the right, meaning there's a shift for a higher intraocular pressure after menopause. And we also measured their outflow facility. And what we actually found, very similar to the human study, was that, but there was a decrease in outflow facility after surgical menopause. So while the clinical study was taking postmenopausal women and giving them estrogen, this is almost the reverse, where they had estrogen and we removed it. And we're actually seeing a very similar effect in the opposite direction, which is what we'd expect. So this isn't just our group, others have actually looked at the impact of menopause on eye pressure in rodents. So this is a mouse model, they also found that overectomy or surgical menopause increased intraocular pressure, whereas giving estrogen decreased intraocular pressure. So there's a few studies that have kind of shown this, and the key concepts to take away from this is, okay, well, if you have the eye pressure and your outflow facility, menopause or overectomy or surgical menopause tends to lower outflow facility, again, making it harder for fluid to get out of the eye, and is associated with a higher intraocular pressure. Whereas estrogen has actually been shown to be associated with a higher outflow facility and decreasing intraocular pressure. And that's pretty key because these things are all very important for regulating or treating glaucoma at the moment. So then the next question was, does surgical menopause impact biomechanics of the eye? And many of you might be asking, well, why is this important? What is biomechanics? Well, so to be fair, I was an engineer by training, and I did a lot of biomechanics in my PhD. So when I started out in research, and biomechanics is really important because it's basically the concept of force, motion, and strength applied to biological systems. And it's actually a very, very old field, dating back to, like the 1700s, or no, well before that, to even Leonardo da Vinci as well. But this is a very old field, and it makes a lot of sense in terms of muscles, tendons, and ligaments, because those are things that both absorb and exert loads on the outside world as we're moving. So biomechanics is very important in orthopedics, for example. But it's actually important to consider that biomechanics plays a vital role in systems throughout the whole body. Almost every cell in your body responds to the biomechanical environment it experiences. And that's no different in the eye, because the eye is actually a quite complex biomechanical environment. So how that eye pressure deforms the eye is very important, because the biomechanical properties of the eye will govern how that eye responds to the pressure, and is likely plays an important role in glaucoma. So what did we measure? So we asked the question, does menopause impact ocular stiffness? So this is ocular stiffness is measured as the change in intraocular pressure, or IOP, in response to a change in volume. So if we put more volume in, and the analog I like to think of this is if you're inflating a balloon, right? So if you're inflating a balloon, you blow into a balloon and it inflates. And eventually, it gets harder and harder to inflate until you no longer can inflate it. But you can actually take a second balloon that maybe is, let's say, less stiff, and it's actually much easier to blow up that balloon compared to the first one. So you can see there might be a difference in how they respond. And so we've actually taken these kind of two groups, pre and postmenopausal, using sham and overectomy as our models again. And we actually found that ocular stiffness decreased after surgical menopause, which is important because this kind of indicates that surgical menopause affects biomechanical properties of the eye, and that will in turn dictate how the eye responds to a change in pressure. But I guess the next question we were asking was, how could surgical menopause influence biomechanics of the eye? Well, what contributes to biomechanics of tissues? So from a lot of other research in computational modeling, eye mechanics, and all of these fields, all of them have basically shown that the sclera largely contributes to how the eye deforms to eye pressure, to intraocular pressure. So the sclera is actually that white part of your eye, just behind. And that part of your eye is actually made up of what's called an extracellular matrix. So in this extracellular matrix, there's a cell. So there's DNA in the cell, and then there's the cell that produces things that go. It's called extracellular because those cells put things outside of themselves, so outside of extracellular. And they're basically putting proteins, these things called proteoglycans, that make up how that tissue will respond to the environment. And these cells in the sclera produce the proteins that make up the extracellular matrix by altering expression of RNA. So you have a cell here, and it has its DNA. The DNA, it gets converted to something called RNA that gets translated into something called amino acids that build into these proteins that make up that extracellular matrix. So we wanted to really investigate how menopause affects this part of the pathway. Now, DNA should be the same because DNA doesn't change just because you've gone through menopause. But what can really change is the expression of the RNA that will then change what makes up the proteins in the extracellular matrix. So to do this, we used a technique that allows us to sample gene expressions of the sclera. And we're not going to go into details here at all, but I just wanted to kind of highlight, you see these orange, or not orange, sorry, I'm not colorblind, but I can't tell colors. It's this teal and purple. The teal is kind of the overectomized or postmenopausal, and the purple is the shams. And what you can really see here is there's kind of this checkerboard pattern where there's areas of high expression in one group and high expression in the other, and low expression. So that means that genes that were highly expressed in one group are lower expressed in the other, and vice versa. And that basically means that surgical menopause did actually, in fact, affect gene expression of the sclera. So why do we think this is all relevant to menopause and glaucoma is the fact that we've shown, not just us, but us and other groups have shown that menopause directly affects intraocular pressure, outflow facility, ocular mechanics, and gene expression. And these are all factors that are highly associated with developing glaucoma, or at least have been shown to be changed in patients with glaucoma. So then we asked another question, which is, well, does menopause affect visual function following injury to retinal ganglion cells, abbreviated RGCs? So obviously we need to know what are retinal ganglion cells. So now if instead of focusing on the sclera, the white part of the eye, we focus on the retina, and the retina is what really processes the visual information from the world. So you have light coming in here. It actually bypasses the whole retina, signals the photoreceptors, which are the rods and cones, and relays that visual information through bipolar cells, amacrine cells, and many other cells in the retina until they get to the retinal ganglion cells, which is the top layer here. And they have their axons. And the reason we focus on retinal ganglion cells in glaucoma is this layer, the retinal ganglion cells, are really important for this disease. The retinal ganglion cells and their axon are what relay visual information from the eye directly to the brain. And it's the loss of retinal ganglion cells and their axon that lead to vision loss in glaucoma. So the main cell affected in glaucoma are retinal ganglion cells. And as patients, some of you might have actually seen devices like these called optic coherence tomography, or OCT, which allows in vivo imaging of retinas in the clinic. So what's interesting about these devices, they can take these images. So this whole band right here between the black and the blue line is actually the retinal nerve fiber layer and the ganglion cell layer. So that's the retinal ganglion cells and their axon layers. And what they're typically doing in the clinic is they're measuring it throughout your eye, and they can identify areas or regions where it's thinner, and they can use this to track progression of the disease or risk of developing the disease. So you might have one of these periodically, or if you're being treated, just to see how the treatment's working. So to do this, we have to have models again to create retinal ganglion cell injury. And one of those models is an intraocular hypertension, or OHT model. And to do that, basically what we do is we block that outflow pathway. So we basically prevent fluid from getting out of the eye, which then increases pressure in the eye, which then leads to damage of the retinal ganglion cells and loss of their axons. Another model we use is called the optic nerve crush model, abbreviated ONC, excuse me. And this is independent of pressure, where we actually go in, do a minor dissection, compress the axons to directly cause damage, which again will lead to retinal ganglion cell injury and loss of their axons. But they're two very different pathologies and two very different models. But in the end, they allow us to both kind of assess what happens in the loss, or when there's loss of retinal ganglion cells. And the way we evaluate that largely is by assessing visual function. So this is a standard eye chart. I think most people, even if you haven't been to an eye doctor in a long time, is familiar with the concept of an eye chart, where they start large and they get smaller. However, we can't simply ask animals to tell us, can you see the E, or is this an LPED, or do you see a B? Like, it's very hard to do that. But we can take advantage of innate responses that animals and we have, which is called the optomotor response, or OMR. And what's really interesting about this is that we can put an animal on a platform, and it has 4 monitors that rotate a band of contrasting black and white. And as it rotates around the eye, or around the head, there's actually an innate response to track that stimulus as it passes. And if it comes from the left, your left eye will pick it up and your head will turn. If it comes from the right, your right eye will pick it up and your head will turn the opposite direction. So we can take advantage of this response to test both eyes separately, so we can injure one eye and see how the vision is versus the other eye. But we can also test different levels of spatial frequency. So this low level of spatial frequency might be equivalent to the E up here, whereas the high level of spatial frequency might be the lowest level of the eye chart. So this is something they shouldn't be able to see, because it's no one can see. It's basically impossible for them to detect. But it kind of allows us to say, well, where on this can those animals see? So the first thing we did with the ocular hypertension model is we confirmed that we actually have an elevation in intraocular pressure. So that's basically all we're showing here. These are control eyes in the hollow points versus the solid, which are the ocular hypertensive eyes. And you can just see that there's an increase in eye pressure overall. But what's really interesting is when we look at the visual function. So here, this is spatial frequency. That's the measure of visual function on the y-axis versus time. So we looked at them before injury and then 4 and 8 weeks after injury. So this is kind of grouping all the eyes together. And we see the dashed line here. This is all the control eyes. And you see it's very stable over the whole study. But after injury, all the ocular hypertensive eyes, there was a significant decrease in what they could see. So they couldn't see as well as before. But what's really interesting to me, obviously, is when you break them into sham, which again is premenopausal animals, or overectomized animals, which represent postmenopausal animals here. Again, if we look at the control eyes, so the blue is the sham animals and the red are the overectomized animals. In their control eyes, so the eyes that were not injured, they're stable throughout the whole experiment. But after injury, there's a significant decrease in function in both pre- and postmenopausal animals, so the sham and the overectomized animals. But what's even more interesting to me is that surgical menopause animals had worse visual function after ocular hypertension. So the key points are, one, that ocular hypertension did decrease visual function, and two, that surgical menopause actually exacerbated the loss of visual function after ocular hypertension. And that's really important. That means given the same injury, these animals had worse visual function after ovarectomy or after menopause compared to if they had that same injury in a premenopausal state. So that's with the impact of elevations in eye pressure. So then again, we wanted to look at a separate model. So here again, we have spatial frequency versus time. Again, we see control eyes throughout the whole experiment were stable. And after inducing optic nerve crush, again, we saw this continuous decline in their ability to see. And now just to distinguish them from the previous groups, the sham is represented as orange and the overectomized are represented as purple. And again, you can see that the control eyes, there is no change in visual function over the course of the study in either group, but they were significantly lower in both the sham and the overectomized group after injury. But again, you see the trend that the overectomized animals were lower, which reached significance by 12 weeks. And that's important again, because this highlights that optic nerve crush decreased visual function overall, but again, surgical menopause exacerbated that loss of visual function after optic nerve crush. So how does this kind of play all together? So if you look at how clinicians or intervene in glaucoma, you have visual function here on the Y, on the left here. This red dashed line is the loss of vision when a person might be declared legally blind. And this would be on the far right here, an individual's death. And on the bottom, it's over their age. So in general, you can have a person suffering from glaucoma is considered a low progressor, which means that they'll have a decline in visual function, but they'll basically be able to see for the rest of their life. They won't have to worry about losing vision. But you can also have people that are fast progressors, or they have fast progression, where they start having glaucoma and there's a really steep loss of visual function. And the goal in those patients is to intervene early to make sure that they have visual function for the rest of their life without being debilitated, by becoming blind. And the goal is to do it early so you can really slow this progression down. Because even if you intervene late, you might not be able to intervene enough you might be able to protect them for a little bit, but eventually they might still lose their vision before they pass away. And so surgical menopause status plays a role in visual function in multiple retinal ganglion cell injury models. So I kind of think of this as, well, maybe surgical menopause results in quicker loss of visual impairments. And so instead of being fast progressors and slow progressors, I kind of think of this as, well, if they're premenopausal, maybe they're following a more slow progressor trend, versus if they're postmenopausal, they're actually following a fast progressors. And therefore, maybe intervening earlier is important. And therefore, kind of from all this work and others, menopause and estrogens may actually play a role in the progression of glaucoma and be potential treatments going forward. So kind of, again, going back to the prevalence of menopause and glaucoma, we found, again, in others, that just highlighting what we showed before, the menopause affects intraocular pressure, outflow facility, ocular mechanics, gene expression, also visual acuity or visual function. And we didn't talk about it in this webinar here, but it also affects survival of those retinal ganglion cells, which are lost in glaucoma. So that's really important because, again, this all is pointing to the fact that there's a connection. So what does this mean? Well, this doesn't directly impact clinical care yet, I don't think, but just going to other, again, diseases, if we look at cardiovascular disease, osteoporosis, osteoarthritis, in each of these diseases, women make a majority of the cases. In each of these diseases, menopause is considered a sex-specific risk factor for developing those diseases. And in each of those diseases, menopause early is associated with a heightened risk of developing those diseases. So while it doesn't do anything for the clinical care yet, I still think a lot of research is needed to bridge our understanding of menopause and glaucoma, but I am hopeful, given the similarities that glaucoma is largely affected by women, early menopause also increases the risk of developing glaucoma, that menopause may be a potential novel sex-specific risk factor for developing this disease. And currently, I think where it leads us, or where it leaves us at the moment, is studying menopause, estrogen, and women's health can have us gain a better understanding of the disease overall, which could be applied to both sexes. It can help us better understand risk factors or what affects those risk factors. And it potentially could help us identify novel targets for treatment that are currently not being used. So with that, I would just like to say thank you for the opportunity to present and promote kind of this very unique area of research. And I will take any questions you may have.
Thank you so much, Dr. Feola. Absolutely fascinating presentation, very interesting. I learned so much. I want to start Q&A session by asking you a question. So it doesn't affect clinical care yet. When do you think it might change, and how long postmenopausal women should wait for it?
I think there's time. We need to really establish that there's this connection. There's still a little hesitation to just state clinically that menopause and glaucoma are related. And I think a lot of it is because there haven't been enough studies directly addressing that connection, that menopause and glaucoma are related. I'd say even in those other conditions, it doesn't necessarily affect clinical care directly. I think what it does do is the clinicians are more aware that if you're postmenopausal, they may need to look out a little more carefully, or they might need to monitor a little more for progression of a disease. And I think that's where you'll start seeing it initially, or hopefully, I hope in the future.
Thank you very much. So now questions from our audience. Would estrogen help with glaucoma after you hit the menopause?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. So our other groups and us have actually looked at estrogen or estrogen-based therapies, and it actually seems to be protective of the visual function in the animal models I've shown you. The only thing right now is, I don't know how many people are aware, there's a bit of a taboo of using estrogen because of the potential, what they call systemic effects or off-target effects of using estrogen widely to treat one disease. So there is some research now in a couple key areas that I think are relevant. One is targeted estrogen treatment in the eye that may be able to be used for glaucoma. So you kind of remove the effects of these potential off-target effects of using estrogen. And two, understanding what's being affected by estrogen in the eye, to then we can target those things specifically. So say we say, oh, estrogen's actually affecting this pathway or this gene expression. Can we now just manipulate that in the eye and completely avoid the use of something else that might have all these different effects? So I think it's where we're going and other people are going, but it's just a brand new field. So it's kind of exciting.
Thank you very much. Next question. I went to the menopause at the age of 45 after chemotherapy for breast cancer. Does it appear that early menopause for chemical, not surgical reasons put me at a risk for more rapid loss of vision? I had trabeculectomies 2 years ago, which has helped my IOP stable in the low teens and a single digits. I have normal tension, glaucoma.
Yeah, that's an excellent question. And I think that goes back to, we haven't specifically studied enough these types of conditions where they're specific. I can tell you there have been studies that are surgical in women where they've had to go through bilateral oophorectomy. So they've had to have their ovaries removed surgically. And I think some of them have been for cancer, not from chemo, but just surgical. And those patients have been shown to actually be at a heightened risk for developing glaucoma. So I don't know in the case of chemo, but I'm going to assume that if it's related to the loss of the ovaries and estrogen, that it might be related, but I think we need we need a bigger population to really understand that connection.
Thank you very much. Next question. For practical usage, is bioidentical estrogen better than synthetic estrogen? And is there time after menopause? Is it too late to start on estrogen?
Yeah, that is a very, very, very good question. So I don't think we know. There's so many different types of estrogen. And I think, I don't know if you're thinking or referring to, there's a few studies that came out actually on cardiovascular disease and the use of estrogen to be protective. So again, in cardiovascular disease, estrogen has been shown, or menopause has been shown to be a sex-specific risk factor. And they actually did this large study where they gave estrogens to a lot of women, and they had a lot of mixed results, so much that they actually stopped the study because they were afraid they're actually making women more at risk of developing cardiovascular disease. And it's a very complicated question because even in that study, they started doing kind of what they call like sub-analysis. And it did depend on the type of estrogen that a woman was given. It might increase the risk or decrease the risk of cardiovascular disease. It did also depend on the timing. So women that got estrogen replacement or hormonal replacement therapy closer to the time of becoming postmenopausal, it actually was protective. But if they waited 5 or 10 years and then went on hormonal replacement therapy, it actually heightened the risk of developing a cardiovascular disease. That's the very general summation of it. But the point is there is probably a type effect and a timing effect. And I think that's also what makes it a little challenging to study and why it's very complicated to do. So we're not there yet, but I think that's something we keep in our minds quite often, when we have to give it and the type we have to give.
Thank you very much. Next question. In the animal studies, is there some form of hormone replacement that can mitigate the negative effects on vision of surgically induced menopause?
Yeah, so there have been a few studies. One gave a specific type of estrogen called estrogen beta and or 17 beta estradiol, excuse me. And they saw that it was protective in vision in like the elevation of the ocular hypertensive model. We've actually looked as well at, it's not estrogen per se, but it's called a prodrug, and that's also been shown to be protective of visual function in the optic nerve crush model. So there is some evidence that giving estrogen does protect the visual function after injury. But again, we're trying to find the best ways to mitigate the off-target effects.
Thank you very much. Next question. So we have time for 2 more questions. So I'll ask you this one, and then after that, it'll be a last question. Have there been any studies on the impact of menopause on the choroidal layer?
So that's a great question. There are some studies that have started to find correlations between menopause and choroidal thickness. So this is becoming, not in our group, but in other groups, they're starting to see that there might be this other association. And that's important because, again, estrogen menopause is known to be related to cardiovascular function. The choroid is a very cardiovascular dominated structure in the eye. So there might be some correlation into the problems relating to glaucoma, cardiovascular disease, choroidal thickness, things like that. So there's only a few that I'm aware of, but there are some studies correlating those.
Thank you very much. Okay, our last question of the night. Is there a link between IVF history and glaucoma?
So that is a great question. And I am not aware of a link yet with IVF specifically. There's been more and more research on just, contraceptive use and potential other diseases, including glaucoma, but IVF is a little harder to study, I think, at the moment, just because I don't know if the numbers are there to know that association with the percentage of people that get glaucoma, but that's actually a very interesting question.
Thank you very much. So we reached the end of our webinar today. I would like to give big thanks to Dr. Andrew Feola for a fascinating presentation for such an important topic of study, and we hope to stay connected with you and get more information as your study progresses. I also would like to thank our wonderful audience for participating and for asking really smart questions. This webinar will be available online, probably tomorrow, the day after tomorrow. It will be available on our website, and it will be available on our YouTube channel. So if you wanted to look at it again and hear certain things that you may have missed, it will be there. I thank you all for participating. Please stay connected to the Glaucoma Foundation and have a wonderful evening. Bye-bye.